we'll do the whole intro thing and everything. I'll record after the fact, but I'll just jump right into this. We're talking with Nathan Ballingrud. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are.
Okay. Nathan Ballingrud is the author of North American Lake Monsters, The Strange. Now I have to look at my notes. Crypt of the Moon Spider, which we'll talk about excessively today, which is the first in the Lunar Gothic trilogy. And well, a slew of others my brain will not encompass enough to remember what they're called. But beyond that, Nathan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
There's not a lot of interesting things to say. Let's see. I'm a single dad. I've done a lot of the usual sort of like writer's work of hopping around with little jobs, tending bar, cooking on offshore rig, cooking in New Orleans, and waiting tables up here. Now I work in a used bookstore, and I do some writing on the side, but nothing terribly exciting.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You just mimicked my life pretty much. I've been a bartender or a waiter or cook of some kind all my entire life for the most part, with just a short break from that field,
Yeah, I dropped out of college, so I'm not really qualified to do much else except that kind of work and write stories.
And you're exceptionally qualified to write stories. You might suck as a waiter for all I know, but I know that you can write stories really well. So, I'm happy for you and for us.
I appreciate it.
Because honestly, I was a waiter for years and years and years, and everybody always said, this guy's a true professional. But inside my head, I was always thinking, I want to shoot you. Why don't you go away and let me go home?
Plus, I gotta feel like the service industry, because you always read about, like writers and stuff with dialogue. I'm sure through like the many cooking jobs and bartending jobs, I'm sure you've seen like your fair share of, both you and Shane, seen your fair share of like interesting characters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, bartending was especially good for that. It gave you a pretty good window on.
Yeah. If you ever want to have a good time with experiencing humanity like you weren't expecting, become a room service waiter. That's a miraculous thing to experience. Trust me.
Because you never know who's going to be on the other side of that door. Like whereas at a restaurant, you see them face to face, and you can kind of make whether it's a snap judgment, good or bad. Room service, it's anybody's guess when that door opens.
I've never done it, but I had some folks when I was tending bar. There was one of my friends was doing that, and she had some stories to tell.
Mm-hmm. Because like when you walk into a bar or a restaurant, they regulate whether you're wearing clothes or not as you come in the door. But when you knock on someone's room and go room service, all bets are off at that point in time. Yeah. And you'd think, for a young man, this is a fantasy come true. And it's like, no, it's not. Anyway, I digress way back in my history now. But let's get right into this.
Okay.
Back in decade ago or more, probably 2015 or so, Laird Barron recommended this short story collection to me called North American Lake Monsters. And he's recommended so much stuff that was just solid gold that I had no choice but to yank that up and start reading, and that became one that I return to on occasion still. There are stories in there that really, really resonated with me that I really love, that speak to my monster adoration, for want of a better word. And then I missed a phase, when the wound stuff and that was happening. I'm still not up on that yet. But I read The Strange, and that one was a game changer to everything else that I've read by you. I mean, it was at first I thought this is totally different for this guy, but it had that, I don't know, almost a kind of a pulpy but not quite pulpy vibe, and people compared it to True Grit, but in space. And I think that's touching the fringe of what it actually is. But I mean, and I'm not sure really where I'm going with this, but that I've seen you start taking these paths, especially with the new one, Crypt of the Moon Spider. I'm looking at my memory goes, okay, this is like if you were to take Charlotte Perkins Gilman, say Mary Shelley and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and put them together to write a story, what might they come up with? And well, they probably wouldn't come up with this, but it sure does, which is to say, it's a great story. Right from the opening, when she's landing on the moon of all places, it's like, okay, this is unexpected. So talk about that a bit, about that book here.
Well, to address a little bit of what you were saying leading up to that book, yeah, I do feel, I guess my imagination is kind of restless. I don't want to do the same thing
Right.
over and over. And after I did Lake Monsters, the one that you haven't caught up on, Wounds, swings very heavily in the kind of pulpy direction.
Yeah.
That's got, it's got satanic organizations, it's got pirates, it's got mad scientists, it's got all the comic book stuff that I really love.
It's got all the stuff I want to read.
And then The Strange was felt, it was very different in the sense that it wasn't really nearly as dark as what had come before, but it was a story that had taken root and just I had to write it down. And even though it did feel a little out of character, maybe is the way to say it. But at the same time, it's like I also like the fact that it's a little out of character, because I would like to kind of broaden the spectrum of what people might expect me to do. You know what I mean? Having said all that, though, Crypt of the Moon Spider is back to the old stuff. It's back to it's pulpy horror. It's it takes place on the moon, as you say, in the early 1920s. There are forests on the moon. So like The Strange, it has nothing to do with reality. It makes no bones about pretending to be scientifically accurate at all. It's a fantasy. It's not science fiction, even though it uses the trappings of science fiction. Science is not in the room for the story. And as I was writing it, I thought it was going to be one story. But as the more time I spent with the characters that surround Veronica, who is for the most part our point of view character, the more I realized that there was more there, and so I thought it was going to be. I realized it was going to be part of a larger sequence.
Yeah. And if you read it, you'll be happy about that. Crypt of the Moon Spider is like my favorite thing to ever say after reading the book was Lunar Gothic series, Lunar Gothic trilogy. And it's like, well, a trilogy might be short, Mr. Ballingrud, but
I was kind of curious about that.
I'm sorry, Rich, what'd you say?
Oh, that's okay. I was just kind of curious about that too, because I saw that it was a trilogy. And I was wondering, like, did you already have like did you already have the whole story mapped out, or was it something where you wrote the novella and just realized you needed, more space to tell that story?
Well, it wasn't really either of those. I still don't have everything mapped out. I'm in the middle of writing the second one, which is going to be called Cathedral of the Drowned, and and I have a notion of what the third one is going to be. I know the basic, the the setup, but I don't know how it resolves. I don't know I know very little about the third one. It's still kind of cloudy. And each one is going to be they're going to be it's maybe more accurate to call it a triptych than a trilogy, only because although you will see the characters reappear, some of the characters reappear in the three. Each one is telling their for example, the first one is Veronica, and that is her story, and is told mostly from her point of view. The second one is going to be focusing a lot more on Charlie, Charlie Duchamp is a character in the first one, and he, although it takes place sequentially, after Moonspider, it is not necessarily a strict sequel in that we find, I'm not sure even how to articulate this. It's Charlie's own story, and hopefully will be contained in the second novella. You have to have read the first one in order to know where he is and why he is the way he is. Pick up on the second one, but it's going to be its own tale, and the same will be true with the third one, which will follow. My current thinking is it will follow Dr. Barrington Cull, who is the primary antagonist of the story of Moonspider.
Yeah, so, that's what. Yeah, my logic went that way too. As soon as you said Charlie, I went, okay, the next one is the Doctor.
Yeah, and it was the phrase lunar gothic that I found to be really evocative, and I thought of it when I was writing the first one. It was kind of like a lamp that was in my head that kind of kept me focused on the tone. Like whenever I would get stuck or not know what to do next, I would just return to that phrase, and that would kind of, it was kind of like my my guiding light. And I realized, this is maybe silly that it was this, but it was like, I don't want there only to be one lunar gothic story that I write. And so when I thought about that, I started thinking more about these other characters and how much it would be fun for me to just do different kinds, approach the idea of the gothic from different angles, really kind of spend some time in this little pocket universe that I've made, which is fun to write in. But also is kind of like, the reason why these are a trilogy of novellas and not novels is I think settings like this that are kind of like densely atmospheric, they can also wear out their welcome kind of quickly. So I think 3 novels would be overdoing. I think 1 novel would be overdoing it, but 3 novellas, I think that's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I also, when it comes to the length, I like the way it ends up causing the pacing to kind of rapid fire at you, where it's like you're reading Crypt of the Moonspider. At least I was reading Crypt of the Moonspider, and I'm going, this is really reading like a slow burn, but I've got like 3 fucking pages left, and I've only been reading.
Yeah.
So yeah, kudos for that. I think that the first one is the perfect length. I wouldn't ask for it to be longer.
That's good.
So
yeah, I agree because I like gothic stories, but it's interesting what you said, Nathan, about like those kind of settings, like maybe wearing out their welcome. Is even though I like kind of gothic stories, I feel like sometimes when they're like longer novels, I get that kind of like fatigue with the setting. So that's what kind of made this perfect for me. And even though it does have all those Gothic, like frameworks, without like spoiling it, it's kind of like a bunch of different things. Like it has the Gothic elements, but it also has some very like fast paced, violent, elements to it.
And I don't mean to suggest that the Gothic itself would wear out over time. I've read many long Gothic works and just reveled in them. Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake is probably the
Gormenghast, yes.
But I think with something like this, where I've got forests in the moon and giant spiders and the other things that kind of happen in there, and the things that will happen in the future ones, I think that the more you ask the reader to suspend their disbelief, the longer you go doing that to an extreme level, like I sometimes do with the stories like this, then you risk toppling it over. I just think that something like this, which is as densely fantastical and asks the reader right from the beginning to believe that there are forests on the moon and you can breathe the air there, that you don't want to test that for 400 pages. Keep it packed, keep it like a little bullet, and just get in there and get out.
But there's something that I think you achieved remarkably, and I'm kind of doing a review of your book while we're talking a bit, and that is, I had no struggle. I don't even remember a transition between not believing there were trees and oxygen on the moon and believing there were trees and oxygen on the moon. I didn't feel like I made a transition, because a lot of times you have to make a choice to suspend your disbelief with things. This wasn't one of those stories. It was just an immediately recognizable, okay, I feel like this is where I belong right now. And in this,
I'm glad to hear. Yeah. And I think that's if I think that's the writer's fault if it doesn't work. I think, whenever I'm asked writing advice, one of the things that I will say, especially when you're writing something fantastical, is that you must always believe it sincerely as you're writing it. No winking, no nudge, no, no little signs to the reader that this is silly. The reader will think, oh yeah, this is silly, but I'll go along with it to have some fun, I guess. But they're aware of that disconnect.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to happen. So like when I'm writing, I believe fully in the environment, in the characters. I don't want the characters to be silly or to tell jokes. I want to take their emotional lives as seriously as I would if I were writing, a drama in America.
It's kind of like, I can't imagine that like guys like Bradbury or William F. Nolan, guys like that, doubted that the environments they were writing in were real. Those were their places that they built, and
Bradbury believed in Mars.
Absolutely.
Fully.
Yeah, he did. Edgar Rice Burroughs believed in John Carter, as far as I'm concerned, and that's just, I don't know, but we're kind of all different levels of writers here in the conversation. So it's like, but those of us, Rich and I started doing this really because we were not really all that experienced in the industry and stuff. And we thought, well, here's a great way to rip off a bunch of writers by getting them to give us free seminars, pretending. And it's worked out really well for me. I don't know about Rich, but I've actually published some shit and everything since we started this stuff. So.
That's excellent.
Yeah, both that and also to Shane's point, like reading things in a different way. Like, I'm not sure about you guys, but like it's kind of like with musicians and stuff, and like when you get like liner notes or kind of those like behind the scenes things. Like I've always been interested, even if it's not, explicitly, okay, this is why I wrote this book, the inspiration, but just kind of that stuff that kind of led there. Like the journey, I guess. Like I've always been fascinated by listening to creatives talk about their journey. And I was just curious a little bit about yours, Nathan. You know, when was the first time that you kind of started getting into writing, like less of maybe as like a hobby and more with like the goal of like creating books and getting published? Like, what did that look like for you?
There were like two stages. So like a lot of writers, I guess I was always, you know, making up stories and writing them down, even when I was very little. But I didn't really think of it as I mean, of course I knew that there was a process for it. But I didn't really start thinking about that process until I was in college, 19, 20, 21 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. And, I started writing a couple stories. Back then we had the great big fat writers markets that looked like phone books that would list out all the publications that were accepting, and it was like a reference, and it would tell you how much they paid and what their addresses were. And so I would get that, and just buying that felt exciting, like I was buying, a set of keys. And I started sending out a few stories. They were, of course, dreadful stories. But they were that's the stage you go through. You have to write dreadful stories before you can learn how to not write dreadful stories. And they all got rejected. And I went to Clarion shortly after that. And that was probably, well, it was culture shock in a way. I was totally unprepared for it. The idea of writing a story a week seemed impossible to me. The idea of writing to market, it was a very rigorous experience, and it bowled me over in a way that was not immediately helpful at the time, but became helpful. It was an experience where having everyone edit your story, I thought at the time that was the point. You're going to take all this information into your story, figure out what you did wrong, figure out what you should do instead, and write a better story. And of course, I would take these manuscripts home after they'd been critiqued by 15 or 17 people or however many it was, and be paralyzed. There's no way to take all of that in and fix a story. No way that I knew. In the years, and so I sold a story right after that, and then stopped writing entirely for like 8 years. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't figure out how to do it, and I also thought that I didn't have anything to say. I'm a 20-something-year-old kid. I've had no real life experience. What the hell am I going to write about? Nothing real. And I wanted to write things that had some reality. And when I mean that, I mean like emotion and truth to them.
Yeah.
But that experience kind of lingered with me over the years, and I've since learned that the advantage of going through an experience like that is not having everyone else critique your story. It's you critiquing everyone else's story. That's where the skills are learned. That's when you learn how to pick apart sentences, structure, figure out why a thing works or why it doesn't. And that's the value of workshops, I think. And so it was about 9 years later that I started writing again with the thought of publishing. And by that time, I guess I was in my early 30s. And I was tending bar, and I wrote a story, Takes Two, and I just sat down thinking, one of the lessons I had remembered from Clarion, one of the more practical lessons they delivered was start at the top. As far as market levels go, you go down the ladder, but always give the opportunity to hit the top rung. And even if they don't buy your story, if you're a good enough writer, they'll start recognizing your name and say, "Oh, here's another one from so and so." Maybe that's the they get through. And if they don't, at least they know who you are. They'll be looking for you.
Yeah.
But to my surprise, I thought the first place I sent it was Ellen and sci fiction. And I've just been selling stories mostly to Alan Datlow ever since.
I think that's really great advice. When I started actually putting my poetry out in the public eye, I started writing it when I was like 12. I published my first poem after I was 50. Yeah. But when I started putting it out, the very first publication I submitted to was poetry. Poetry magazine, and they're the biggest. They're gonna give me like fucking $700 if this thing is really that kind of thing, to someone who's just starting out. And it's like, I've submitted to them every poem pretty much that I've submitted went to them first, except for the ones that were blatantly horror poems. And I've never been published by them. But I say same advice though. It's like, okay, I'm shooting for this market, and then I'm, kind of letting the jack handle ratchet down a notch and down a notch as I need to, adjust, but I learn every time, because you go from this doesn't work for us at this time, blank, to, hey, keep submitting, and it's like, okay, that's what you want to hear more than accepted almost, is we're looking at you. So
I still rather take the acceptance, but yeah, you're right. Once you have their attention, that's, you've crossed a certain threshold.
Yeah. I also aimed at that market though. Another little tidbit about that with me is because I hate rejection really bad. So I hit the market that I knew would reject me so I could get that out of the way and start feeling, you know what I mean? Just a thing with me. So anyway,
I think I experienced that too, to maybe a different degree, but or in a different context. But after I sold that first story, all of a sudden I felt this enormous pressure. Back then, there were all these forums. You remember the Nightshade forums were the big thing. All the people in the genre were posting there. And the story came out, and it generated some buzz. Some people were talking about it, and I felt, oh, this is great. People know who I am, and my first story, people like it. And then it's time to write a second story, and I felt, oh no, I have to do that again. How do I?
Right.
You put this pressure on yourself that you have to repeat it. And so I sent the next story out to Ellen Datlow, and she rejected it. And it didn't make me feel bad. It made me feel free. I was like, oh, well, thank God. I've been rejected. And I still feel okay, so I can keep going. It sounds silly to say it out loud, but I know what you mean. Sometimes
that's a good way to put it. We could call it rejection survival.
Yeah.
Right. We made it so we can continue forward.
Yeah, it's kind of like
you say you've got to be able to take a hit. You get punched in the face and you realize, oh, it didn't kill me. This is a thing that I can endure.
Exactly. If your skin is too thin, I recommend anything but waiting tables or writing.
For sure. Or any public facing thing for that. It's interesting you guys said that too, because almost like with another artistic medium, like with like musicians, that was always the thing too, is that like, they had however many years to craft that debut. And then like, if that debut is huge, now there's the expectations, and it's like, yeah, you had however many years last time, you've got like 6 months.
Right.
Yep. It changes as you get noticed. Yes. Frighteningly so. I've managed though, and this is something I was going to ask you about. I've managed to maintain my position of writing everything I write for myself still, and that's before if I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, if I'm not embedded in it, so to speak, and like we were talking about previously, believing in it, it just doesn't resonate with me, so it has to be for me first, and that seems to have worked for me. But what is your approach on that, your idea about that?
I'm similar. If I don't believe in an idea, then writing it just feels like punishment.
Exactly.
But I have two. I keep two people in my head when I write. Myself first, I have to feel excitement for it. And sometimes I won't feel excitement for a story except when I'm in the act of writing it. I wrote something called The Butcher's Table. And when I stepped away from the story, all I could think about was how ridiculous it was. All these crazy elements in there that
I feel that.
who was going to buy that? But then when I sat down to write and I was actually in the world, I believed in it 110%. But the other person I keep in my mind is the reader. And it's not in the sense of hoping that the work is popular or is accepted, but in the sense of am I being honest? Am I being honest with the story? And I'll imagine my ideal reader, which I suspect is not an unusual thing for a writer to do, but either the ideal reader is someone who's a little smarter than you are, who's going to read your work in good faith, who's not going to be looking for reasons to pick it apart, but is going to know when you're bullshitting too. Who's going to know when you're not being honest with the story or yourself. And so I keep that in mind as well. I have to satisfy myself, but I also have to make sure that I'm living up to my bargain or my agreement rather, because I think that a story it's ultimately a collaboration, right? You write a kind of a blueprint. Comes the story, and they bring their own psychology to it and their own outlook and experience and history, and out of that kind of that sort of collision of perspectives and the written word, that's where the story happens. And plus, a reader is shelling out money, right? They're putting money down to buy this book, and money is tight these days, and they're devoting time. They could be playing a video game or watching YouTube or taking the dog for a walk, but no, I'm going to sit here and read this book by this person.
Right.
Obligation. You have an obligation to not fuck around, to not phone it in.
Right. You're asking for a certain level of work from your readers, so you need to put about 1,000 times more of that work in yourself to make sure you, like you say, don't phone it in.
Yeah, you've got to make sure you're fulfilling your part of the bargain. And I also think too that every time I write a story, I think for somebody this is going to be the first one they read from me. I want them to want to come back. I want them to trust me after it.
And I think that's a good assessment. Every book you write could be the first book somebody reads by you. Right. So yeah.
What are they going to think of me when they're done? Are they going to trust me? Are they going to think that this person delivered on his plan? Or is this just, was he writing the contract? Is just churning out words to make $1 and the story is just like a million other stories out there.
Exactly. Before I forget this, because I forget shit frequently, one of the things I had noted that I think of as a pretty remarkable way to enter what I think of as a fantasy scenario, in like the real world, it's like most sci-fi authors, pure sci-fi, they shoot for these far future, unimaginable, locales and technologies and whatnot that, allows them to work outside of reality a bit, or a lot. And you went the other way, with both of these, and it kind of just totally changes, but it works so well. I wonder if that's intentional for you, that, hey, this is so long ago that people aren't even going to really be concerned about that, the facts so much as this is fantastical to them,
Yeah, it wasn't a conscious thought. I don't think it wasn't like a decision that I made. It was just, that's how the story was. Like when I conceived the story, it was already in the past. It's just part of its identity as it came to me, but I do think that's part of it. I think well, there's a couple things. I think the most obvious one for me, not obvious, but the primary reason for me was that it was just the fun way to do it. It seemed like that's how I wanted to do it because it was going to be fun to write and fun to think about. And, spending time in that place would be something that I would enjoy, which I need to do if I'm going to devote, however long it takes to write one of these things. I want to be there.
Yeah.
And the other was that, I guess it changes the lens through which the story is read. I think if I were setting something like the Madhouse on the Moon today, you have to be talking a little bit about modern perceptions, the modern understanding of mental illness, and then of course you're going to ask the questions. I think people will be less likely to buy A Forest on the Moon if you're setting it today, too, frankly. And in the future, it's like you can't really get away with that. Or if you did, you'd have to explain somehow. I'd have to give some dumb paragraph about terraforming and how this came about. And I just don't care. That's the last thing I care about.
So you reached back and grabbed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, moon style surgeries going on.
Well, yeah, it's and a lot of those the things that are in that novella, the brain surgeries and the way they work are directly, their DNA comes straight from pulp magazine. And EC horror comics, all that stuff that I love so much. That aesthetic that I was really kind of looking for and wanted to revel in these days.
And you nailed it. In my opinion, you nailed it.
Thank you.
So I was always that guy, especially with comic stuff and things like that. I was always for the creepy comics, and I wasn't a big superhero guy. I was much more of the macabre comics. So yeah, you're writing to a love of mine, but also, I mean, for me, it's a different thing for me because I also absolutely adore sci-fi as a reader. I don't necessarily read as much of it as I read, horror, noir fiction, stuff like that. But I read a lot of it, and I've always loved it. And probably my favorite genre and creation is horror in space. So it's like, I mean, yeah, these are lovely fantasy novels. They're also fucking horrifying, and they happen in space, and I'm always going to be there for that.
Yeah, it's a very particular flavor.
Kind of like kind of like Event Horizon.
Yeah,
it's great. Or like John Taft's Plastic Space House was a great space horror novel.
I don't know that one. I have to check that one out.
Yeah, it's a good one. But Rick, sorry, my son-in-law's name is Rick. Rich?
No, so good. Yeah, I thought I'm the same way, like those kind of like mashups, and I don't want to give too much about them away, but I loved how like there's just a sense of eeriness about like the hospital that Victoria finds herself, and especially like the alabaster scholars, like those characters. And two, I was just curious, like obviously it's a novella, so you have to kind of be, cautious with like length and word choice and stuff. But I like how you kept it and their history like kind of vague, because that's what makes them so eerie. And I was just curious if that was intentional, kind of too, like keeping it more vague so that readers can kind of fill that in. Because that's what I did, and like not knowing if they're like, fully like their whole history, whether they're fully human or if they're a little bit something else. There's so many ways the reader can interpret that.
Yeah, that was absolutely intentional. One of the problems I have with a lot of horror is that it spends so much time, or it feels this, so much of it feels this obligation, I think, to offer explanations. And so the horror becomes like that. By the end, I think of it in a term of acts. So the first act or the second act tend to be very creepy and mysterious, and that's when you really feel engaged. And so often the third act, it's like, okay, well, here's why the ghost is doing this. Here's where it comes from. Here's how this monster happened. And by the end, there's no scare anymore because there's no fear. You're just seeing somebody make a cat's cradle and just drawing all the conclusions. It's a clockwork mechanism by that point, and it's all the life has been leached out of it. And so I definitely try to stay aware of that and keep as much mystery in as I can. With the Alabaster Scholars and the Moon Spider itself, it was like, I want to give enough that the reader should sense that I know what is happening, but not enough that that it takes away the mystery. I think mystery is where the life is in a horror story or a fantasy story, or maybe even any story.
I agree with you on that one. Just to interject, and I won't take over your thread, Rich, but like the people who really, really floor me are like Gemma Files, Nathan Ballingrud, of course, Brian Evanson, Stephen Graham Jones. These cats like that, all these people I'm describing, that's something they rarely do is explain anything to me. They just give me those what the fuck scenarios and say, make of it what you will and leave me wondering, I mean, that's the way when you hear that fucking bump in the night, pardon my language, I shouldn't say that, I swear all the time, but you hear that bump in the night somewhere, what keeps the fear alive is not knowing what made the bump, so.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that
this is why I find...
Oh, go ahead, Nathan. Go ahead. No, that's okay. I don't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, this is why I find David Lynch's films so unsettling. It's nightmare logic. There's never going to be an explanation for most of what's in his movie, and you're going to have to provide whatever kind of understructure there is, and I find that so effective and so very creepy.
Yes, me too. Lynch is something else. I mean, even his TV is just, I mean, the wonder that is Twin Peaks still just every time I see it.
Yeah. The way that third season ended, the last scene was just one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen.
No.
And two, I feel like touching on something you said earlier, Nathan, about like thinking about the reader and stuff like that. We had a conversation early on in our podcast with Kathy Koja, and it was kind of the same thing about where she said, her works are kind of like a conversation with the reader. And I feel like that kind of ties into with that ambiguity. Like also it helps ratchet up the fear. But like a lot of the books that I like, like the author has their interpretation maybe, but like allows for that space so that like, regardless of who's coming to that book, whatever kind of background they have or fears they have, they can almost overlay that onto those kinds of books, kind of like with her book, the Cipher and the Fun Hole. Like you never know what the fun hole is exactly. Like you have an awareness of what it is kind of, but you could theoretically put anything over top of it.
Right. Yeah, that's where they draw their power. You're trying to tap into that subconscious. I think horror is like, this is kind of a banal observation, but horror and comedy are often compared to each other. One of the reasons for that is that they're aiming for very specific things, and each person's triggers for either one are going to be different from the next person's. And the more you allow for your reader to provide their own subconsciousness to inhabit your story, I think the more effective it is.
Yeah, because you're letting them bring their experience to it. Yeah, I mean, if that makes any sense at all, that's what I think.
Oh, for sure.
You're giving me the chance to take my past and my, quote, knowledge and experience and apply it to the story, at least so far as my interpretation, when you don't tell me everything about it, I think that's been a long-standing, pretty much motto of this podcast, there's various hosts and whatnot, is do not tell me what, every single little detail, don't, go all none on me and go into the past and tell me exactly why this monster that I should be scared of is no longer fucking scary.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but it begs the question now. You're working on book 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have a working title? Or anything?
The working title is Cathedral of the Drowned.
That's right. You did say that earlier. Okay, that's intriguing as hell. And you're not going to tell us anything more about it, pretty much, except for this.
No, it's still in a state of flux, so I better not.
Yeah. So that leads me to, before I forget this, my sense is that you're kind of, one of my unfavorite terms, but you're kind of a pantser when you write.
Yeah. I like to know a few things. I have to know a few things. I kind of want to know roughly where the end is. I don't have to know exactly what it is, but I kind of want to know what it's going to feel like, if that makes sense. The feeling I want to have and to evoke. Or sometimes there's an image. But yeah, often I don't know much else about it. And the discovery is in the doing.
Yeah. That's interesting too, because I had an author tell me very early on when I started actually working on fiction, which I'm that guy who's published 1-2 stories and is afraid to try to publish another story because I'm not sure what's expected of me, really. I threw a dart and it made a mark. But I forgot what my train of thought was there.
Well, for that question, I almost feel like we should start putting a little spin on it. Those like charts you'll see like online, and it could be anything, like how you roll up the bread bag or whatever, like the whole lawful, neutral, chaotic, evil thing. Yeah. The six things, because I feel like sometimes people are pantsers, but they have like guideposts. And then sometimes you have plotters, and then, my whole kind of thing, and I'm still very new into this, mostly in the stage you were talking about, Nathan, with sending out the dreadful stories, but is like I come up with like a cool idea, and then it's just full engines ahead. And then at the end, maybe try and, mold it that way. And I mean, it works for me. And that's what I always love, that question when Shane asks it, because everybody's approaches are so different, even though you can't necessarily take someone's approach. It's kind of cool to see like what they like about it.
Yeah. Everyone's approach is going to be different. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And I suspect it's true of me that even the answer I gave you is only true maybe a little over half the time.
Mm-hmm.
Even any answer I give you would not be universally true for even my own experience.
Yeah.
Each story will have.
Sorry.
No,
that's what I have been leading up to, just so I retain this thought. And that was early on after I started publishing, and when I wrote that first story, Todd Kiesling. I asked him what his goal was when he started writing a story, because I knew he was a pantser, and I'm very much, pantser is grabbing words out of the ether and piecing them together like a puzzle. Then that's what I am, But he said, all I do is imagine the feeling I want my readers to have when I finish this story.
Yeah.
And I found that immensely, immensely helpful to me. Probably some of the most helpful advice I've had. So even as a poet, I find it immensely helpful, So like you said, what are you looking to evoke out of this? So sorry, that was my interjection.
That was true. And sometimes I won't know where a story is going to end up. I think that I will. I think that I do. But then I write it and it ends up somewhere else. Or like this novella I wrote called The Butcher's Table, I didn't know where it was going to end. I know there was going to be a big event at the end. I knew what that event was, but I didn't know what the fallout was going to be. And I didn't know until I got there. And that doesn't happen that way often, but when it does, it's kind of exciting.
Oh yeah, I love stories that end with the writer being surprised with where they ended, because guaranteed the reader is surprised too at that point in time,
Yeah, especially because they're so intimately in the story that, like, if they can surprise themselves, not necessarily saying that the reader will like the surprise, but you're at least going to elicit that kind of reaction, because even you as the creator was kind of taken aback by it. So I would imagine that would translate positive or negative to somebody who's reading it.
I would think so too. But, it's also worth saying, though, that surprising the reader, isn't necessarily, the point of a story. It doesn't have to be. I think that's more important when you're focusing on a plot-driven story. But there are some stories in which, the reader will know pretty well where it's going. But it's the process of getting there. It's the how the character is revealed. What kind of experience the character has once that inevitable ending is reached. Each story will have a different intent behind it, a different idea or thought or something that it's trying to deliver. And sometimes that means the ending should be a surprise, and sometimes that's the last thing that anyone cares about.
Yeah. Kind of on that note, like when I was reading Crypt of the Moon Spider, like you could tell it has all these different elements. And, some writers, they have, a sense of like, okay, I'm going to write horror and I'm going to kind of work in this realm. Is that something that applies to you, Nathan? Or is it more like you kind of almost eschew genre and it's basically like whatever the story dictates, and I frame that kind of like, Joe Lansdale. He's written crime, he's written horror, he's written in all these different genres, but it's almost like he has his own genre. He's not necessarily beholden to any one thing. Is that something you kind of strive for with your work too?
Yeah, it is. I don't think of myself as a horror writer, and that's not because, when I say that, sometimes it can be interpreted in a negative way, and it's not meant that way at all. I obviously love the genre and work in the genre, but it's a psychological thing. When I think of myself that way, a sort of like a cookie cutter frame comes into my psychology. I start thinking of the story that I'm trying to work with in that particular light or according to that particular frame, and then I start to feel, confined in a way that I don't want to feel confined yet. Even if a story I end up writing naturally fits that frame all by itself, at least I wasn't thinking that I was aiming for that. It's a subtle distinction that maybe only makes sense to me, but that was one of the reasons too that I wanted to. When I wrote The Strange, I had a lot of anxiety about it because it was quite different from the first two books and was not overtly horror. And I almost scrapped it at one point because I thought this was going to be, a terrible career move. The more thing to do would be to write what people are expecting and what readers I have would like to see. But then I thought, and it was kind of what you were just saying a few minutes ago, Shane, where it's like you were thinking, you get this thought of what are people expecting from me? that by doing something a little bit different, I will tell them in the future what kinds of things they can expect from me. It's like putting stakes in the ground, claiming territory. North American lake monsters was a particular stake, a different one, and then this is a different one. And suddenly, the landscape that I've put flags in is a little broader than it was before, and so that gives me more leeway in the future, even if it's only in my own head that it gives me that leeway. That's kind of where it's important. And anyway, horror ended up working its way into the strange anyway. I kind of can't help it.
Yeah. And that's cool. And I like the way that you said that about like the whole cookie cutter thing, because that's like, I feel like that's a very accurate representation. Cause like I've seen advice where they say, write the idea that excites you, but that you're kind of scared of in a way. And I imagine it kind of fits that kind of framework in that, like, by not focusing on that and labeling yourself in one way, you're not confining yourself before you've even started. You're leaving all the possibilities there.
And here's another way to say it. Is occasionally I'm invited to contribute to anthologies, and the editor will send me, here are the guidelines. This is the kind of story we want. We like this, we don't like this. The kind of thing we all as writers see these things. And if it's a horror anthology, and if I want to be in that anthology, which often I do, it changes the way I approach it, because, and I don't like that it does. I try not to let it, but it does. If I already have an idea that fits, that's the best, because I won't. The idea is already existing. But if I don't have an idea for a short story yet, I will kind of let my mind cast around for something. But it's casting around in a particular part of the pond. It's like, oh, it's a horror story, so I'm going to go fishing over here. And that's not the way I like to find my ideas. I like to just have them, sit there comfortably with my line in the water, and whatever comes. It's a metaphors a little bit, but and again, that's probably only in my own head, in which it's a problem, but it is. So I have to deal with it, and that's one of the reasons why I try not to think of myself as a very particular kind of thing. Probably the most I saw. Clive Barker once called himself a writer of, I think, if I remember that correctly, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it's essentially he said he was a dark fantasist, and I thought that was accurate for Barker. He started out very much horror, but became much more broad in his scope.
Right. Later. After Damnation Game, he kind of started really painting his pictures.
Magica, yeah, and that's kind of how. That's the most accurate way that I've found that I can think of myself. I think of myself as dark fantasy, because that's usually where, so far, that's where all of it has ended up. But again, that's also taxonomy, and who cares, really?
Yeah. This is our.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say we always have at least one uncomfortable silence per episode.
I was just going to say to Nathan's point, with the whole taxonomy thing, like, I can relate to that as well, because even as a reader and a reviewer, like, my favorite, and again, not to disparage horror in any way, because I run a review site called The Horror Bookshelf, but I like horror stories. Yeah, is that, like, I like when they are horror stories, but there's also like little bits of this and little bits of that kind of muddy the waters. And I'm not necessarily to that point, like, as a reader, I'm not interested in like rules of like, this is what makes this horror, this is what makes it not. It's more kind of like what you said about like a feeling and not getting caught up in like words or, expectations and things like that.
Yeah, they start steering you psychologically in ways, it's subconsciously, you don't even know you're being steered by these things.
Well, and if you get too involved, I think, and I used to think of myself strictly as a horror person, and a closet poet, because I didn't really talk about being a poet, but as a fan goes, thought of myself strictly as a horror person. But then when I started trying to define myself as a writer, the suit didn't feel comfortable anymore, because it's like, God, I mean, every now and then I sink into it. I mean, not sink into it like it's beneath me, but every now and then I slip into the horror genre. And every now and then someone will invite me, like you, to an anthology, hey, create a poem for me for this anthology, and it's like, yeah, I do that, but it's not, I don't feel comfortable, if you say, because it also kind of defines me socially, and I don't like that, like if you're on social media and people say, oh, here's another great member of the horror community, and it's like, no, not really. I mean,
Yeah, it's a strange thing. Most of my friends are in in the writing world are very much horror writers. That's how they talk about themselves, and that's fantastic because it works for them. I always get self conscious when this subject comes up, that I'm going to sound as if I'm being, my in any way sort of dismissive, and it's definitely I'm not at all. It's just like I say, it's just the way I have to kind of like arrange the dials in my head in order to get it to work the way I want it to work.
yeah, I think the same thing. I always think, God, I hope nobody thinks I'm being disdainful. I love horror. I just don't like definitions a whole lot.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of looking at it.
And I guess this point, it's 100 and some degrees outside here.
Oh, geez.
And I have 2 gardens I'm taking care of right now, mine and my daughter-in-law. So I'm going to hit the question where I say, what's next for you, sir? Do you have other publications on the horizon that you know about?
No. So what's next is, of course, Crypt of the Moon Spider comes out in August.
Mm-hmm.
After that, will probably be Cathedral of Drowned, which, if everything is going according to schedule, will come out next August. Next year's August, that is. And I'm working on a novel, which hopefully I'll have finished in the next year or so, and just try to stay busy and try to keep things on the conveyor belt.
Yeah, that's awesome news, though, knowing that you're staying busy writing, knows that I'll have more of your words to stay busy reading. And I highly recommend to everyone, Crypt of the Moon Spider. Rich Duncan and I have both read it. We both loved it. It releases on, correct me if I say anything wrong, releases on August 27th. You can pre-order it now on Kindle and paperback. And God, I can't recommend this book enough. I can't wait for the next one. And Nathan, thank you for being here. I love you, man.
Thank you so much. It's very much mutual. I'm excited to have been asked.
And we will definitely have you back, sir, very soon.
Good. I can't wait.
Rich?
Yep. Thanks, Nathan. And again, everyone, Crypt of the Moon Spider, great book. Pick it up.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you.